welcome back. It's episode 3 in Making a Strip by me. Yes, so part 3, coloring. Now, I do my whole strip in watercolor. What you can see I'm doing here is I'm just prepping the page. I'm using a gum eraser to get rid of any of the pencil, and you'll see I'm holding on as well, so I don't, even though it's taped down, you can ripple the page a bit. This is a little quick. I generally will mix colors. I used watercolor out of a tube. So here I'm mixing the skin tone and ample amount of water, getting everything ready. Before I go into the actual coloring, however, I use a process called wet and wet. So what I found that with the Bristol board, it does two things. The initial wetting, it absorbs the water super fast, and I'm left with some pretty gnarly, obvious brush strokes. So what I've decided, I mean, it's all an experiment for me anyway, but what I found was that if I did the wet and wet technique, so wet the Bristol with clear water first, and then come in with the pigment, I found that it smooths out a lot quicker and a lot easier. You don't get any obvious brush strokes. You get a pretty even distribution of the paint. Oh yeah, and always have Kleenex at hand. And it's I don't do it for I do it for primarily for the skin tones and the backgrounds. It kind of works, I think, like a bit of a mask as well. So if you go around the eyeball without using the water, and then you come with the paint will tend to stay where it's wet already. So you're not having to worry as much about accuracy. Not that I worry overly about accuracy anyway. I like how watercolor gives them more of an organic feel than digital coloring. Well, at least my digital coloring. There's clearly a lot of people that are very, very good at coloring digitally, but I prefer the organic feel that watercolor gives me. So I'm just touching a few things up there. Yeah, so what I'll usually do is I start with the skin tone, and I'll go through the whole strip and lay in what would in the digital world be called flats. So I do all the flat work first. And you'll notice I've got 2 comics up there. It's actually just as quick to do 2 or 3 strips at the same time, because as one's drying, the other one I can be working on. So rather than just getting up, and I don't artificially dry it with a hairdryer. I could, but I do most of my painting at night while my daughter's asleep. So those of you who have toddlers or little kids at all knows that having them sleep through the whole night is a pretty precious thing. So I avoid the use of, I've just kind of got used to not artificially drying the paint. So here I'm doing a background with the my absolute favorite pigment, Payne's Gray. It's I tend to prefer the more muted tones. So mixing Payne's Gray with pretty much anything will give you a nice muted tone. Even as an overlay wash, it works out quite well. So I use primarily 3 brushes. My go-to brush is a Winsor Newton Series 7 number 3, which also happened to be my favorite inking brush until I screwed it up by getting ink in the too far up, and the brush split on me. But I was able to reform it well enough to be able to apply watercolor. This is a number 12 that I'm using here. I mean, you still get a pretty fine point with a 12, but the number 3 is the only one I have that is 100% sable, so I use it for the critical areas. So I've done the skin tone in every panel, and now I'm going in and doing the flats in the background. It's not really a system for me. It really depends on what I feel like. I always start with the skin tone, but I don't necessarily always do the background next. Now, these happen to be, it was convenient for me to do the background because every background is exactly the same. So I guess I'll do it in an order that makes it fastest and easiest. But again, the background's wet and wet. But the hair, I'm going in with the hair here, and now this is wet on dry. The hair, I like having a bit more texture to anyway, so I don't really care if you can see the brush strokes. Yeah, and usually I'll go in with a really light first pass. I mean, with watercolor, you darken by going on top. Unlike oils where you can add highlights after the fact, watercolor, you have to be mindful of the highlights as you're going. But with the hair, nah, I don't really, I like it to be kind of sloppy. So here I'm just bringing in a little extra pigment. Just a quick note on the paints that I use. I use the Winsor Newton Cotman watercolor, which are hue. They're not top quality pigments at all, mostly because I can't afford the top end stuff. Plus, I had no idea what hue meant when I started doing this. So there you go. So now this particular paint strip, I decided to experiment pretty drastically, actually. I knew I wanted a background, but I also knew I wanted it to not draw the eye. Anyone familiar with the Pacific Northwest of the U.S. or our Pacific Southwest knows that in the winter it's awfully gray and misty. So this is the technique that I'm going for here. So I'm laying in some building background, just like little high-rise stuff, which kind of potmark the North Shore where I live. And to be honest, I looked at it as I'm looking at it here and thought, oh, damn, I screwed up. I really had no idea what I was doing. In fact, this is the first time I've ever used a square brush or a flat brush. So this was all a very, very intriguing experiment. I don't like what I see here, but I knew from just the meager experience I've had that with watercolor, I often dislike the first pass every time. And by the time I get to the end, it looks a lot better. So here I'm going in over the flats I'm darkening some shadow area, bringing in a little bit extra pigment. You can also see that I kind of skipped a bit through the magic of editing here. The clothing and my daughter there are painted in the background already. So I try to define, like I think most people do, one light source. It just makes it a little bit easier. Now also with the skin tone, I will add a bit of blue for the shadow areas. And always have your Kleenex for excess paint. And then after I've get all the first pass stuff done and the skin tone second pass stuff, I start to go in detail. So I'm adding a bit of texture to the trees, just with a little side to side stroke of the number 3 brush. What I really like about watercolor is, and it can be a serious detriment as well, but for the most part, I love the fact that the colors will bleed together so rapidly. It really is, for me anyway, I got a kind of fly by the seat of your pants experience, which is one of the reasons I really like watercolor. Is unless you're absolutely amazing at it, which I'm not, I oftentimes will have absolutely no idea how something is going to turn out until it's done. And I think I've been pretty lucky so far in the fact that I, as a general rule, I'm really happy with how things end up. So this is how I'm finishing the background off. So I went back in with a really heavy, very wet Payne's Gray wash over top. And it worked. And what I had hoped would happen, and it did happen, is that it softened off the edges of the buildings that I put in with the square brushes and gave it almost a kind of misty feel. But I'm going in extremely heavy here with a very wet wash. You can see the paper starting to buckle, even though it's taped down at the corners. The Bristol buckles way faster than uh, a, a heavy watercolor paper will, even if the papers are considered to be the same weight. Um, yeah, watercolor is fun. I mean, I'm clearly not getting paid to make this comic, and I love doing it. But the reason I love doing it is because it's fun. And having chosen to use watercolor without having really any experience at all in it um, was strictly a fun based decision. I didn't grow up as an artist. I never worked as an artist, and watercolor just seemed like a really fun way to get color on the page. And to me, it looks alive. Not to detract from people's digital work, because it's very good as well. I've seen some beautiful digital painting, even when it's primarily flat work, using their inks as highlight and shadow. But I like watercolor. And I hope that all of you enjoy the comic as it's painted. Yeah, I don't really care too much if I go over the lines. I mean, I do take the comic into Photoshop for lettering and any cleanup work. I do try to keep the cleanup to a minimum digitally, but I will ditch the outside of the panel lines and clean it up from there. Well, this brings to conclusion my 3-part video series on how I make By The Fingernails. I hope that you guys have enjoyed it, and yeah, keep reading the comic. Thanks a lot. Don't forget to check out the comic at bythefingernails.com. It updates on Mondays. And you can also follow me on Twitter at DA Schubert, and my Facebook page, which is facebook.com/daschubert.art. Thanks for watching.